太极门的，我可以怎么着更低？他的拍摄，你就是找到进来。
这个没位置啊，没位置。 偷懒。
Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Forward Alliance, I would like to say welcome. Welcome to our distinguished guests today, our two speakers here, Matt Pottinger and Ivan Nafathi, who just landed in Taipei last night, less than 24 hours ago. I want to say welcome to our important guests, our visitors, and journalists with us today, and welcome to the members of the public. We're all here today because we share a deep concern about the peace and security of our country and our region. We're here to talk about the Golden Boat, Urgent Steps to Defend Taiwan. This is a book that was just published by the Hoover Institution. It was edited by Matt here and co-authored by Matt, Ivan, and a host of co-authors that they will share with us later. You might be familiar with Matt's name, his Chinese name, Borming. He's the editor of this book that we're here to talk about, and I think it's safe to say I can think of no one more suitable or qualified than Matt to lead this important effort in this project. As you may know, he was a journalist in the late 90s and early 2000s in China, working for Reuters and the Wall Street Journal. He was a U.S. Marine, having been deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan on 3 tours. And he was the senior director for Asia at the U.S. National Security Council before becoming the White House Deputy National Security Advisor. He is now the distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution, and I trust all of you, like me, like I am, we're all looking forward to hearing from Matt today. Ivan, to Matt's right, to your left, they've been colleagues since their time at the National Security Council. Ivan is the author of several important chapters on Taiwan in this book. When we first met, Ivan worked here at AIT as the Deputy Chief of the Liaison Affairs section. But some of you may be more interested in his other background, his experience as an F-18 instructor. He taught for 3 years at the U.S. Navy Fighter Weapons School, and you may also know that program as Top Gun. Since his years working with Taiwan, he has served as Deputy Senior Director for Asia at the NSC and as a Director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia. He is now the Adjunct Professor at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service and is Non-Resident Senior Fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, CSBA. Between them, though, you have a wealth of experience in security policy, accumulated from their time at the White House, on the ground in Taiwan, and on the ground in China. They, along with their co-authors, have written a book that addresses not just what Taiwan must do for our own security, but what the global alliance on a rules-based order must do, on our own and together, to maintain peace across the Taiwan Strait. This book combines insights gained from international experiences. It is informed by a clear-eyed assessment of facts on the ground. And it is about managing risk in the real world, as opposed to one that we wish existed instead. So I'm honored to have played a small part in this project, but I will leave plenty of time for them to tell you more. Before I do that, I want to acknowledge the esteemed guests we have with us here today. Quite a few of you I'm proud to call friends and partners with whom I look forward to working even more closely in the future. We are brought together by a shared concern for peace. Peace based on mutual respect. Peace based on values that we all hold dear. We have members of the international community here, official representatives from Japan, from Australia, from the UK, from Canada, and colleagues from the German, European, and Singaporean offices. We have policymakers in Taiwan. Mr. Chou Yi-ren, who led the Office of the President, the National Security Council, and the Executive Yuan, who most recently served as the chairperson of the Taiwan-Japan Relations Association. We have Admiral Li Shiming, our former Chief of General Staff. We have the current Deputy Minister of Interior, Mr. Sawyer Mars. We have the spokesperson for the Office of the President, Li Wen. And we have senior academics and leaders from civil society, spanning nonprofits and industry. Chris Liu, representing the Westminster Foundation for Democracy, Harry Harding and his colleagues from the Center for Asia-Pacific Resilience and Innovation, Lo Ying-tai Cultural Foundation, Yu Ji-zhong Cultural and Education Foundation, the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom, the European Value Center from Prague, and the American Chamber of Commerce in Taiwan, and many, many more. I apologize if I miss you in your organization, but all of you know if I keep going, I think the caffeine that is sustaining Matt and Ivan is going to wear off soon. But I want to point out that looking at the representation here, it is clear that Taiwan's security affects the security and the prosperity of all of us. It extends well beyond the shores of Taiwan. When we discuss a collective security framework, whether it's articulated through a free and open Indo-Pacific or the Quad, this concept can be traced back to Japanese leadership. Former Prime Minister Abe once said, "A Taiwan emergency is a Japanese emergency, and therefore an emergency for Japan-US alliance." People in Beijing, President Xi Jinping in particular, should never have a misunderstanding in recognizing this. Now, this position has encouraged the international community to stand with Taiwan, and I know the Taiwanese public will always remember this act and demonstration of solidarity. Friendship between two countries is not just about caring for the plight of each other, it is also exemplified through working together to ensure a stable and secure neighborhood for all of us. And so I'm grateful today to our special guest, Mr. Kazuyuki Katayama, the Chief Representative of the Japan-Taiwan Exchange Association, for joining us today. Katayama-san has been a public servant his entire professional life. Throughout his distinguished career, he has been posted around the world, including many times to the US and many times to China, as I found out recently over lunch, notably once during Tiananmen. He is approximately 6 months into his term as Japan's representative here in Taipei, and I'm grateful that he has agreed to help us kick off today's conversation. So if you would all please join me in welcoming Representative Katayama to the stage.
Thank you very much, Mr. Enaku, for kind introduction and kindly inviting me to today's book launching event. And first, I warmly welcome Mr. Matt Pottinger, editor of the book, and Mr. Ivan Kanapesi, co-author, who are both directly charge of China and Taiwan affairs at NSC during the Trump administration. Taiwan is a very important friend for Japan. We are close economic partners and enjoy a strong bond with the frequent cultural and people-to-people exchanges in various levels. And above all, we share fundamental values such as freedom, democracy, human rights, and rule of law. And the peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait are essential not only for Taiwan, but also for the rest of the world, especially Japan. And indeed, it is critically important for Japan to keep a free, open, friendly, democratic, and peaceful society like Taiwan as its neighbor. The world now faces a turning point of history while we see Russia's aggression against Ukraine, a rise of the global south, and the most severe security environment surrounding Japan. And post-Cold War period has ended, and international relations have become more complex. And Japan needs to respond to these challenges with its own efforts, as we are doing now, as well as in close coordination and cooperation with its allies, especially the United States and other like-minded countries. And in this connection, Taiwan is a very important partner for Japan. And I expect that the boring mode, this book shows us practical steps we must take for building our resilience against the coercion and aggression, and for making deterrence function to avoid catastrophe of the Taiwan Strait, which could inevitably give a serious impact on Japan's security. And I very much look forward to reading the book and of course today's event. And the book is published very timely, and I also hope to have the early publication of a Chinese and the Japanese translation for sharing the awareness more widely. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Katayama-san. Now, without further ado, I'm going to ask Matt and Ivan, before we begin today's panel discussion, to say a few words to help us set the scene. So, Matt Pottinger, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks so much, and Katayama-san, thank you for your terrific remarks. I was in Japan yesterday with Ivan. We met with senior officials in your government, and I can assure you that the Japanese government's views remain heavily focused on the interests of Taiwan, because as one of the things we learned over the process of writing and researching this book is that the future of democracy and sovereignty and prosperity in Taiwan matters for the future of democracy and sovereignty and prosperity all around the world. For democracies, and even for countries that are merely aspiring democracies, Taiwan matters greatly. It's great to see many friends here today, and I thought I could start by just mentioning a little bit of the story of why we wrote this book in the first place. I visited Taiwan back in 2022, and then many times since then. But in 2022, one of my colleagues that I was traveling with was Larry Diamond, who's a democracy expert working at Stanford University and at the Hoover Institution. And it's really started with a question. The question was, what are we learning from the war in Ukraine that Taiwan should know now so that we can avoid a war here? And it really just started with that question, and we think that we've deduced some of the lessons that we think Beijing is drawing from the war in Ukraine. But here what we're really writing about is sort of a military approach for the sorts of lessons that the democracies, Taiwan, the United States, Japan, Australia, and others in the region, as well as Europe, should be doing to avoid a catastrophe like the one that's playing out in Europe today, creating enormous heartbreak in Ukraine, and even enormous heartbreak in Russia. Russia has now lost an estimated 500,000 men, either killed or badly wounded on the battlefield that their dictator sent them into. So I might start with just a few general observations from our research. And by the way, the people who contributed to this book, it's kind of a remarkable group of people. I was very, very lucky to have as co-authors senior officials, like Congresswoman Luria from the United States. She's a former naval officer. We had veterans from the US. We had veterans from Taiwan's military, including one sitting next to me right now. We had combat veterans from Israel, and some of the lessons that we think Taiwan can learn from Israel, as well as the NATO Secretary General, former Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen, writing about what Europe needs to do. But the way we structure the book is with a set of recommendations for what Taiwan needs to do, the United States, Japan, as well as Australia and Europe. But before I ask Ivan to make some opening remarks, since he really led much of the writing on what Taiwan needs to do, I thought I would mention that deterrence is a lot cheaper than war. And it's funny, in hindsight, when people argue about whether they should spend 2.5% or 3.5% of their GDP, or even 4 or 5% of GDP, these are often very contentious arguments in peacetime, because your military is one of those things that you don't know that you need it except in an emergency. And in fact, if you're doing it right, you shouldn't have to use your military to actually fight. So it's often very difficult in a democracy to lean into making the sorts of sacrifices you need to make in your budgets in order to deter. But deterrence is so much cheaper than war in terms of the human cost, the economic cost, that it almost becomes comical. That the fights that happen in peacetime about what we should be spending should be so contentious. Deterrence doesn't happen by accident. Sometimes it seems that if you just amass a lot of equipment and you train young men and women to use that equipment, and that somehow it kind of just all works out to achieving deterrence. Deterrence is actually an act of psychology. You don't deter a nation, you deter decision makers in another nation. And when you're dealing with a dictatorship like the one in Beijing, you're really trying to deter one person. There's one man who will make the decision about whether to plunge the world into grievous pain and suffering through warfare, or whether to refrain from pursuing war. And deterrence is about eroding the dictator's sense of optimism about what he can achieve in warfare. Believe it or not, one of the leading indicators of war, that a war is coming, is when an aggressive leader becomes very optimistic about war, becomes optimistic about what he can achieve in warfare, and what he believes he can achieve through war that he wouldn't be able to achieve through diplomacy and peaceful means. So we should be thinking about eroding Xi Jinping's sense of optimism about war. Also, we learned that will to fight, the will to resist, is the most important factor. We call it the X factor in maintaining both deterrence or in a crisis, actually being able to resist in wartime. And building up the will to resist an aggressor is something that is very intangible. It's something that you can't measure the way that you can measure how many airplanes and ships and anti-ship missiles and submarines you have. And it's something that you acquire through practice, through a shared sense of responsibility, a shared sense that this is not just a military responsibility, it's not just Taiwan's military or the US military or Japan's self-defense forces that bear the burden of effectively deterring an adversary or defeating an adversary. It is the collective society at large. And so practicing through exercises and conversation and training, talking about what would happen in a war and how the society at large should respond, sometimes it seems unpleasant, but actually the better prepared Taiwan is, the less likely it is that Taiwan will have to fight. And finally, the democracies need to work together better to solve the problem that has been exposed by the Ukraine war, the problem of insufficient defense industry capabilities for making munitions, the bombs, the missiles, the anti-air stingers, the Javelin anti-tank missiles, the things that are necessary for our militaries to be able to fight quickly and effectively, but also to sustain a war. If Xi Jinping believes that we are dangerous, but only dangerous for the first few weeks of a war, he might calculate that it's worth him fighting because he believes that the Chinese military can fight a long war or a protracted war. We have to show that we're capable of fighting a protracted war so that we don't actually have to fight it. And that means enhancing our ability to manufacture munitions. But with that, why don't I turn to Ivan?
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Enoch. It's great, really wonderful to be here. Obviously, to be back in Taiwan, and great to see a lot of old friends, many of whom I got to work here on exactly these issues. And I guess I'll start kind of why does an American get to presume to tell Taiwan what they should or shouldn't do, right? And so I guess I don't think I should, or anyone should, have that right. But I'll give you just a bit of a background on why, kind of how these thoughts came about. And it's, I served in the U.S. Marines, as I talked about, for many years before I came to my assignment here in Taiwan. I had, 19 years in the Marines, mostly flying jets, but a lot of time at the tactical and operational levels. And this was my first real job that I would say was at like a strategic level. And it was really an amazing experience because I got to spend 3 years, most of my time, with the Taiwan's military. I mean, I got to go to almost every Taiwanese base from all the different services. I mean, I didn't just go to Jinmen and Matsu. I went to Dongyan and I went to Wuqiu, which there are not a lot of Americans that have been to Wuqiu, trust me. And so I say it with some humility that I got to receive a lot of information and education and thoughts from the members of Taiwan's military. And I hope that I've been able to absorb that and sort of make some sense of it and translate it back. I was in the room in May of 2017, I remember, when Admiral Lee Seaman had just pinned on Chief of General Staff, and it was the first time that he articulated to the U.S. government, and I got to be one of the couple people in the room, what he would later call his overall defense concept. So a lot of the information that comes out in these pages, I think is taken from really advice and recommendations and observations that were given and transmitted to me by Taiwanese military folks themselves. And I'll add, I left here honor and obviously the privilege to continue working on this set of issues with Matt, under Matt, at the National Security Council, and again, with several folks here in this room. And I think we've made a lot of progress, and this book highlights some of that, but really points to what more we have to do. And Matt just talked about deterrence. The book we wrote it's an optimistic book. I want you to know that. If you haven't read it yet, hopefully you get a chance to. And the point is that we are deterring. And by we, the United States, Taiwan, Japan, whoever else, we are deterring and have been deterring, for decades. The problem we see is that maybe that deterrence has started to erode, and maybe we're not aware enough, and if we kind of don't pay attention, one day we're going to wake up and we have eroded enough that Mr. Xi Jinping will think, you know what, yeah, I think I can go for it today. But for decades, they have not believed that. We have been winning. We are still winning. And it's more of a recipe to make sure we continue to win.
Thank you. Thank you both for that. As you alluded to from your position at the National Security Council in DC, Matt and Ivan, in case you weren't tracking, have helped to steer the biggest shift in China strategy in arguably the last 40 years. And so part of that shift is taking a hard look, an honest look, at facts on the ground, trends on the ground, and asking the question, how can we make sure that deterrence continues to work? And this book, I'm proud to have played a small part in its formation. This book takes many lessons from around the world, Ukraine, Israel, to name a couple. And I think it stands out in the way that it provides concrete recommendations on what we individually and collectively must do to continue to deter the CCP from taking military action against Taiwan. I think for the Taiwanese audience, if I may make a couple observations. I think for the Taiwanese audience, this book debunks a couple myths, and I think points out a couple perhaps inconvenient or sensitive observations. Right? Myth number one: cross-strait tensions are of Taiwan's doing. Cross-strait tensions are a result of the DPP administration's provocation of Beijing. And I think, I'm going to ask Matt and Ivan to speak to this later, but I think that certainly conveniently overlooks the intention and everything that Xi Jinping and the CCP under his leadership has been aiming to do, which is precisely to change and continue to disrupt status quo. And that is not happening just against Taiwan. I think we should all keep in mind, if you take a step back and look at how the CCP has conducted itself in Asia Pacific, in this region, and arguably further out from Asia Pacific, you'll notice that this is a pattern of behavior, continuing to push and push. Okay, so long, and I know you have a great quote on it with bayonet. So I'll leave that with you. But I think one of the questions that we're going to have to address here is, how do we assess the CCP? How do we assess the PLA? And because that's an ongoing big debate here in Taiwan. And what if we're wrong? And what if we're wrong? So myth number one: cross-strait tensions are of Taiwan's doing. And as long as Taiwan stands down, as long as Taiwan stops talking about national defense, we will continue to deter it. Okay. Myth number two, related, is that Taiwan must therefore distance itself from the US, okay, and seek to balance its relationship between China and the US. I think the fact is, most of us here agree that the military threat is too great for Taiwan to attempt to take on alone. And so democratic partners need to find a way to work together to ensure peace. In this context, if Taiwan were to keep its distance from its friends and partners, I think that raises serious questions about Taiwan's credibility, and which ultimately, to Taiwan's detriment, compromises Taiwan's national security. Earlier I mentioned a couple inconvenient observations. I hope that we will have a spirited in lively conversation around these points. I'll just raise three out of the book. Number one, Matt has already talked about that Taiwan is not prepared for rapid mobilization nor prolonged conflict. Okay? And that compromises, causing to question the credibility of our defenses, which affects our ability to deter. Observation number two is that Taiwan is misallocating precious defense resources. Okay? This is an alarming issue, particularly considering that we are working with a significant resource disparity across the strait. And observation number three, which might be least pleasant to hear, is that MND leadership has long stood in the way of progress. And this affects the public's confidence in our military, in our defenses. As I said, I'm proud to have taken part in this project. I think we have to be honest with ourselves and recognize where we are falling short. This is the only way we can rise to the challenge. And this is the only way we can ensure a peaceful and sustainable future. That's why we are all here today. We had left some time for members of the press to take photos. We did that already. So I think it would be helpful, with your agreement, to go straight into the panel discussion part of today's agenda. I had wanted to ask Matt why you structured the book this way, and you touched on this on your opening already. And you have talked about lessons from Ukraine. But I want to ask you, if you can help us, talk through what are the lessons that we can draw from around the world, the right lessons and maybe the wrong lessons that people are drawing from Ukraine, from history. Okay. There's a narrative in Taiwan that discussing national defense on its own, not to mention bolstering national defense, is provocative towards Beijing, leading to a worsening cross-strait relations. So part one of my question is, what do you think people get wrong, or right or wrong about the CCP? And the part two of the question is, what do you think people get right or wrong about the PLA, as I mentioned earlier? And part three, related to those questions, where do you think the biggest risks are, if you or others are wrong in their assessment? Hope that's not too much. Yeah.
Thanks, Enoch. So, some of the lessons that we've learned, I think, one is that we should not be complacent. There was a tendency early in the war in Ukraine, or the new phase of the war that began in February of 2022, when Vladimir Putin launched his full-blown armored assault towards the capital of Ukraine. There was a little bit of self-congratulation going on when we saw how bravely and how effectively the people of Ukraine fought to repel those invaders. And people thought that Russia losing the war was inevitable. They really did fail in their goals when they launched that. But I think that some people have thought, therefore, that Xi Jinping will be very, very careful before he ever considers using military force, because he doesn't want to be humiliated and drawn into a long conflict the way that Vladimir Putin's forces were humiliated at the outset, and now they're fighting this long, very costly war. I think there are, however, other lessons that Xi Jinping might be drawing. We see some evidence from writing by People's Liberation Army commentators and others. One is the idea that fighting a full-blown war from the outset is preferable to an incremental war. If you think back, the war in Ukraine actually started a decade ago. It started in 2014 when Vladimir Putin sent troops into Crimea, activated them, and then spread into other parts of Ukraine, and you had a sort of a low-intensity conflict, but an incremental approach to war. The cost of that approach for Russia was that it allowed the Ukraine and also the United States and European countries to work together with Ukraine to provide eventually armaments, but also very important training to teach Ukraine how to fight. And so when Vladimir Putin finally went for the whole big invasion, he was quite shocked, I'm certain, to find that Ukraine was a very capable fighting force. They were ready to repel. So I suspect that Xi Jinping will probably, if he uses military force, he will probably be coming all the way in. He'll be looking to conquer Taiwan, annex Taiwan, fait accompli invasion, as opposed to an incremental set of steps. Another lesson that I think we shouldn't be complacent about is the threat of nuclear blackmail. Nuclear blackmail is a form of psychological warfare. It's something that Vladimir Putin has done. He threatens, whenever he doesn't like what we're saying in Europe or in the United States, he starts to talk about using nuclear weapons. I think that Xi Jinping, given that he is significantly increasing his nuclear arsenal, he wants to be able to have the psychological advantage of threatening nuclear war. But we should take it for what it is, which is a psychological tool, more than a credible threat of a real type of attack that he would employ. I think the other thing we learned that's positive is that geography really matters. Geography matters. And what would Ukraine have given to have 100 miles of ocean between Ukraine and Russia? Taiwan has this extraordinary protector in the form of the Taiwan Strait. That's what we refer to in the title of the book, the boiling moat. 金城汤匙, this phrase from the Han Dynasty, which is about a strengthened defense, the types of strong cities or city-states that are very difficult to attack. And so I think that geography works to Taiwan's defense. Taiwan is not an easy place to invade. If it were, China would have attacked a long time ago. And so we should be optimistic that with smart investment, hard training, good coordination between Taiwan and the United States, Taiwan and Japan, Taiwan and Australia, we can effectively deter even this great big military that China is building. One of the things, one of the strange paradoxes of warfare is that it actually takes far more men and equipment to conquer territory than it takes to defend territory. And Taiwan has an asymmetric advantage. China cannot win a military conflict unless it can cross the Taiwan Strait and actually occupy, through an amphibious invasion, Taiwan and control Taiwan's population. We think that we can stop China before it even reaches Taiwan's shores, and do so at relatively low cost compared to all the enormous amounts of money China is spending on its military.
I think Matt, you just check it. All right. I think you just touched on an important question here. In Taiwan, we see a narrative on two ends of the spectrum. On one side, there's been a lot of talk and a lot of emphasis on the might of the PLA. On the other hand, we also have seen plenty of literature talking about how that's overplayed. And any focus on the PLA's capabilities, their modernization, how they are outspending and outmanning Taiwan is a form of information warfare aimed to affect and reduce our will to resist. And I think the truth, I suspect, is somewhere in between. Or perhaps you might say it depends on what the question is. But certainly I think what this book does is sets out concrete steps that are doable and practical and within the realm of possibility, however optimistic it might be, in addressing this threat. Now, everything we're doing is in hopes of ensuring that we continue to deter. In this book, you've referred to many ways that Taiwan seems to get, many things that Taiwan seems to get wrong about deterrence, whether in terms of strategy, force structure, or even how we deal with gray zone operations. And so I think you're gonna, when this book is translated in Chinese, I think you're gonna hurt a lot of feelings. And I think it's only fair that we addressed some of these issues one by one here today. As you noted in the book also, the Thai administration over the last 8 years began some important reforms while falling short on others. And so I want to put this question to you and ask you to share with us what you think the most important and most urgent reforms are for the Lai administration.
I'll let Ivan talk a little bit about some of the key reforms that we would recommend, and I can supplement you on that a bit. But I wanted to pick up on the point that you raised, Enoch, about things that we get wrong, some of the assumptions we make about deterrence that we get wrong. The most common one, and this is not just Taiwan, we're seeing this in the United States, we're seeing it in many countries that haven't fought a major war in a long time, and therefore we've forgotten some of the lessons written in blood from the 20th century. Some of those lessons include the idea that the firmer we are in standing up to aggression, the less likely that aggression is to continue proceeding. So we often tend to think of the way that states act as being similar to the way that other people act. If you get into an argument with a friend, you actually want to be the first one to extend an olive branch in order to maintain good relations with people that you care about, your family relationships, your spouse. That's not the way that state-to-state behavior proceeds. It's not like person-to-person behavior. We know from history, and we know even in just the last couple of years, that the weaker a dictatorship thinks we are, and the more that we try to appease them or reassure them, the more aggressive they become. It's the opposite of how we should be conducting our affairs with fellow people. This is an aggressive state that is acting to wage war in Europe. It is an aggressive state that is backing terrorist proxies around the Middle East to wage war against the United States and Israel and Arab states there. It is an aggressive state across the Taiwan Strait that is becoming more and more aggressive, primarily because it believes it can get away with that aggression, because we've fallen into this sense of self-doubt or this fear that we might be provoking those actions. Chapter 3 of our book goes into some depth about these dynamics. And for those of you who are in the media, I'm a former journalist. I would describe Chapter 3 as the lessons I wish that I had known when I was a journalist. And before I learned more about it through the experience of being a practitioner, as a Marine, as a national security policymaker, and as a student of history. Some of these lessons are counterintuitive, but they are true. They are actually rooted in historical example. And it includes these ideas that, in fact, accidental wars don't really happen. The accidental war is a myth. There are a lot of political theorists, political scientists who theorize accidental wars, but when you talk to historians, the historians can't find any true examples of wars that was started by accident. This is one of the biggest misconceptions that I read day in and day out in newspaper articles, or even from senior leaders up to and including the President of the United States, where we're under this misapprehension that wars start by accident. If we understand that they don't start by accident, we'll have more confidence to push back against aggression or bullying in ways that actually will be stabilizing in the long run. So I invite those of you who are in the media in particular to pay attention to Chapter 3. I talk in particular about one historian, an Australian historian named Geoffrey Blainey, who did a wonderful book years ago called The Causes of War. He studied several centuries of warfare, all of the wars from the 1600s through the end of the 20th century, and he was amazed to find that there were no truly accidental wars. There are others as well. Michael Howard, the late professor at Yale and Oxford University, who came to the same conclusion. Evan Luard, who was a British scholar and historian and also a member of Parliament, a socialist. So it doesn't matter if it's left-wing or right-wing or centrist. Historians have found that there really is no such thing as an accidental war. Therefore, we should have confidence pushing back against bullies.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I couldn't agree more. Obviously, I think the simple way of saying it is, as Reagan did, right? Peace through strength. And that undergirds a lot of this book is the idea that you achieve peace, which I think we can all agree is the goal, but you do it through strength. The corollary, I guess, unspoken then is that weakness, incites aggression. Yeah. And we see, and it's not everybody that says this, but there are folks in Washington, and I think here in Taipei, that are pushing a line on what one might call reassurance toward Beijing, right? We have to do things to reassure Beijing. And I think that Beijing sees that as weakness. So we have to be very careful about what's happening. We saw this play out in 2021 with Vladimir Putin, when the United States, frankly, and others in Europe, unfortunately, sought to reassure Putin by various things in 2021, including, quite frankly, suspending the sale or transfer of lethal arms to Ukraine for a time in that year, right before. And of course, we all know how that ended up in February of 2022, that it did, in fact, invite aggression. So what else, Enoch, do we need to hit? Go ahead, Matt.
Just to hit on Ivan's point, these are recent examples of weakness being provocative. The opposite of peace through strength is weakness is provocative. And so when the United States failed to defend the red line that the President of the United States drew back in 2013, the President of the United States in 2013 said that if the Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad used chemical weapons against his own people, the United States would take military steps to retaliate. Then he did use those chemical weapons against his people. The President of the United States chose not to make good on his threat. It was exactly 6 months later that Vladimir Putin began the war in Ukraine that has now lasted for 10 years. When the Taliban overthrew the Afghan government and the United States retreated from Afghanistan, it was 6 months later that Vladimir Putin began the new phase of the war in February of 2022. We have been rather appeasing of Iran, and Iran has rewarded us with violence. We have just not long ago lifted sanctions on the Venezuelan dictator, Nicolas Maduro. Nicolas Maduro is now massing troops on the border of his neighboring country, Guyana, and threatening to invade Guyana and to annex part of Guyana. So there's a pattern here. We need to be strong, sometimes uncomfortably strong, in order, paradoxically, to achieve peace and stability.
Yeah, I think the main set of reforms revolves for Taiwan and for the United States And we see it kind of happening in both places, but maybe not with the speed and not with the amount of broad resources that the task calls for. And that is specifically to really enhance the ability to, one, manufacture but have on hand stockpiles of munitions. We see this war of attrition happening in Ukraine, and that's a land war, and it's very different. And they're shooting, with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of artillery shells every month. In a maritime fight, which it will be here, on Taiwan and in the Tongzhi, right, the boiling moat around Taiwan, I think we're talking about really what missile systems, and possibly, as we're seeing now, autonomous unmanned systems, drones, some of which would be lethal ones that are designed to self-destruct on finding their targets. So essentially smart munitions, but having those in extremely large quantities, orders of magnitude more than we currently find here on this island, and orders of magnitude more than the United States currently has deployed here in the Western Pacific. So those kind of reforms and doing that urgently, we believe, will certainly give the PLA and China's leadership a lot of pause, and again, help us not to lose the deterrence that we have.
Ivan just talked about drones' impact on war and on military competition, and even though in Ukraine, the context is a land-based conflict, I think the same trend would inform future competition in this part of the world, whether at sea or in the air. I want to put a question to you, if I may, and this, I want to talk about investments on the other end of the spectrum that you talk about in your chapters in the book. Specifically, I want to ask you about programs that have been a source of pride in Taiwan over the last few years. And I am referring to the Taiwan Indigenous Submarine Program. Okay. I don't want to put words in your mouth, okay, but you alluded to that program as an example of a misallocation of resources. You've pointed to the aim to achieve long-range strike capabilities against Chinese or PLA targets, whether it's a carrier or a Chinese inland city, as being misguided. Given the amount of resources, billions, that Taiwan, under the former administration and the current administration, given the billions that we're devoting to these programs and programs like them, I'd ask you to, I know people will want to challenge you, and so here I'm asking you to perhaps make your case to folks here on why you feel the way you do, and how these expenditures help or don't help Taiwan in bolstering deterrence.
Yeah, and I don't have the exact numbers offhand on what the submarine program has cost, but I know it's quite exorbitant, right? And it's just a question of cost benefit at this point. I mean, for Taiwan, whose GDP is 1/20th the size of China's, and realizing that China's, according to U.S. government personnel who dig a little deeper than what China admits, China's defense budget is somewhere around $700 billion US, about 3 times what they admit to, and Taiwan's never going to come close to that. So being very efficient with spending obviously is critical, and that is probably the most important part of quote unquote asymmetry, if you want to be use that term. Now, Matt mentioned before that geography matters a lot, and Taiwan has this distinct advantage. Well, there's another aspect of geography that matters a lot. Even though Taiwan doesn't border China, it's got 100 miles, that's actually what in modern warfare we would consider not to be standoff. That's the opposite, and it's what the U.S. Marine Corps calls stand-in. And what the U.S. Marine Corps has developed is concepts of warfighting, stand-in forces. And so Taiwan's geography drives it to do things that require inherent resilience. So platforms that can survive under large, immense amounts of fire, frankly, missiles coming down. And that means being relatively small and mobile. So those kinds of platforms with the kind of munitions and drones that we talked about before are critical in this geography. Now on our side, collectively, the United States and Taiwan side, should we have long-range weapons and long-range platforms? Absolutely. But we're not going to base them here. This is not the place to put them. They're way too vulnerable here, just in their inherent basing. And so I think Taiwan understanding its geography and its role as part of the broader coalition is really, really critical. And so those tools, whether they're extremely long-range assets, even submarines and things like that, they are absolutely critical to this fight. But they are going to come to this fight from well outside when the time comes, because that's how they will be used most effectively and how they have the most survivability.
The submarine program, it's very understandable why Taiwan pursued a submarine program. A lot of the rest of the world was not helping Taiwan. In fact, I think there's better cooperation today than there was 10 years ago, and between Taiwan and other countries and other countries' militaries. So Taiwan was left by itself. It makes sense that Taiwan should want to develop its own defense industry. In fact, Taiwan has a very capable defense industry, very impressive in many ways. And I don't think that even if the submarine program were to no longer expand, if the submarines that are already ordered get built, and it doesn't go much further than that, there are still going to be benefits from the engineering sort of knowledge and experience that Taiwan's engineers gain to work on other weapon systems that will be cheaper but actually more effective because you can make a lot more of them. And that includes undersea unmanned vehicles. So smaller submarines that you don't need people to ride in, but which will be very, very dangerous to the Chinese Navy. And so I think those are the sorts of capabilities that Taiwan should now be pivoting to. There's no use in crying over money already spent. Let's spend the money in ways that take into account the ways that warfare is changing. We're learning from the experience of Ukraine. Ukraine succeeded in sinking a significant part of Russia's navy using very cheap, homemade, autonomous weapons. Basically jet skis that were remote control and had bombs in them. And so much so that the Russian Navy is frightened to operate in those waters around Ukraine now. So there's a lesson in that for us. Taiwan has really deep, excellent, innovative industries and very smart engineers. This is where you want to start evolving fast towards things that ultimately are going to be cheaper and more effective.
I'll just add, one of the pushbacks that we'll occasionally hear when I make this point that Taiwan is in a stand-in location, it should be a stand-in force, and the U.S. and other partners that are further out should be the standoff from Taiwan. One critique of that is that, well, we don't have a defense treaty, right? We don't have a mutual defense treaty, and that's true. And I don't think we're going to have one anytime soon. But I think that is actually probably the wrong question or point to make, in that there are lessons here from Ukraine too. And I would point you back to way back in February, or maybe it was March of 2022, when Zelensky said something to the effect of, "No, I don't need a ride. I need you to send me more weapons." Right? I'm not going to skip town here. We're going to defend our country. And I think Taiwan, in real time, when this crisis occurs, the piece of paper, the treaty, is probably not nearly as worthwhile as the demonstration, the ability to demonstrate that, you know, Taiwan's going to fight for itself, and that will bring the like-minded allies on board. It has to. We saw it happen in 2022. You know, before that war kicked off with Putin, everybody, except for probably the Ukrainians, had written it off that it would be over in days, including the United States. And they changed that. The Ukrainians themselves and the Taiwanese people, you know, need to have those stockpiles to hold off long enough to convince, you know, the free world that, oh wow, these people are suffering, and they are for sure worth saving.
Just on the subject, on the topic of partnerships and alliances, maybe you can, in the little time we have left, and I want to touch on gray zone because this is quite important and current. It seems to be happening every day. So, but before we get there, on partnership, please talk a little bit more about how you, in your chapters, you talk about deconflicting. You talk about where Taiwan should look to invest and engage versus where, which responsibilities we should hope that partners can shoulder. And as part of that, it's true at the operational level, and I believe that when you discuss this concept of deterrence by detection, ISR, you also mentioned about a network of overlapping areas of responsibilities. So if you could maybe share with us what it is that you mean and how that would work absent of treaty, as you say.
Yeah, I think when we talk about the gray zone in the book, we kind of frame it around two words, I guess, that would be instructive to how Taiwan should think about things, and that is patience, having patience, and applying perspective, right? Applying patience to the right perspective of what's actually happening. And I think what we've seen over the last few years is certainly an increase of aggression, right? In the naval, in the air, from the People's Liberation Army, in and around and close to Taiwan. But there's a lot happening out there that is not actually particularly threatening to Taiwan. The southwest corner of the ADIZ, which is how all this started a few years ago, is actually closer to China than it is to Taiwan. I mean, if China sends their planes off their coast and does some training 50 miles off their coast, guess what? They're in the southwest corner of Taiwan's ADIZ. And that's actually pretty normal behavior for a military to do. And so I think being able to discriminate appropriately on the things that are getting really close and the ones that aren't will help. It'll help people understand and not become numb to the idea, because I think we're reaching the point where if it happens too much, we become very numb to it, and the allies become numb to it. And so I think being a little more selective about what requires a response, I think the military here has done a good job of that, but then maybe messaging what requires, pushback in the narrative space. And really these air and naval fights, if you will, and exercises, they're really just utilized by China as a series of political signals. The truth is, China doesn't actually need to launch a single plane or a single ship to do immense damage to this island. We all know this. There's 2,000 plus ballistic missiles sitting across the strait. They can hit a button. Those ships and planes are not required. And so kind of, again, perspective and understanding what the threat really is, I think would be important.
Yeah, I mean, related to that, remember the government in Beijing talks about what it calls the three warfares, and the three warfares that it's waging against all of you already, okay? That is information warfare, psychological warfare, and legal warfare. The activities around Taiwan after President Lai's inauguration, this sort of rehearsal of a blockade, that is an act of psychological warfare. It's designed to create a sense that resistance is futile. It's that there's nothing we can do to stop this. But in fact, it's only the psychological impact that really matters. Those activities aren't able to change the true facts of who controls Taiwan, and it still remains firmly in the hands of voters here who elect their government. The information warfare, which is related to that, is about promoting these ideas, usually through social media apps in particular. I'm very, very disturbed to hear that TikTok is becoming more popular in Taiwan. TikTok is an information warfare weapon, and Xi Jinping has effectively designated it as that. Back in 2021, Xi Jinping held a study session for his Politburo where they talked about new forms of information warfare. And he said that China will use the internet as the main battlefield. And he specifically, according to the People's Daily a couple weeks later, writing about this study session he did, the People's Daily said that short-form video apps such as TikTok are the types of new innovative things that can be weaponized to win the majority, which really means influence your thinking in ways that can be really harmful to free societies. So information warfare, Beijing is waging very, very vociferously. So again, to Ivan's point, these gray zone activities, once you realize that this is really about a psychological effect and not an operational change of the facts on the ground, it's less effective at achieving its goals.
Just to answer the question you asked about deterrence by detection, I won't go into detail. It's not my concept. It's at the think tank I work at, CSBA. Some colleagues have been writing about this for years, and really in the context of building allied networks. I think nowadays we'll rely heavily on unmanned platforms, most likely, but the idea that you would tell your adversary, or your adversary feels like you're always there and we can always see him, no matter what the PLA is doing. We're there, we're observing, and they know it. And we know, we're watching them, and it's sort of like put the shoe on the other foot, that they're doing these intimidating sort of things, and we're Taiwan's sort of publicizing them on Twitter or X, but it's the idea to flip it back on them, be like, you're not going to get the jump on us because we can see you, and you can do that hopefully in a relatively inexpensive way, and we think through partnerships, leased platforms, data as a service would also enable Taiwan to tie in even more closely with partners and sharing of information through these ISR platforms.
I think that topic requires an entirely separate workshop. In the interest of time, before we open it up to the floor, I want to throw one more question at you. As you know, Taiwan has just appointed our first civilian Minister of National Defense in many years. And as one of his first acts, he has announced changes to how things are done in the military. For example, he has announced that certain bayonet drills would be terminated. He has announced that certain marches wouldn't be done anymore. He has announced that perhaps over weekends, units wouldn't have to report back. Individuals wouldn't necessarily have to report back their whereabouts. And this has caused a stir amongst the defense community, amongst veterans, amongst opinion leaders in military affairs. And my question is about culture. I hope that as two Marines you can share a little bit your views on how culture, how organization culture can change and must change, how to facilitate that. Because everything we're talking about here today requires change, whether it's reform, whether it's innovation. And that requires, change can only happen in the right context, in the right environment, under the right culture. And so I think in a capable and forward-leaning military, you wouldn't need a minister of defense to tell everyone whether to do a certain type of training. You wouldn't need a Minister of Defense to say, no, this is not the right way to march. Okay. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, in an institution that might be less open to change, even a decree by a minister might not change things. Right? So I came from Ukraine last month, and when I was in Ukraine, someone who worked for the Territorial Defense Force in Ukraine explained the Ukrainian military culture to me by explaining that it's a Soviet military culture. And what they mean is military is like a prison. What they mean is that officers motivate their men through fear and humiliation. As Marines, and given the book here talks a lot about about all the changes that need to happen, that can only happen in the right culture, in the right environment. How would you advise, how would you propose that we think about organizational change? How we create that environment of change and innovation, that bias towards action, using your words? And does that start at the top? Does that start at training? Does that start at education, or all the above? If maybe that's my last question for you, and then let's go to the audience.
Describe to me the sort of marching that got canceled by Minister Koo. It wasn't really goose stepping? Yeah. So we were really privileged to be able to see Minister Koo this morning. Look, I don't know, someone should use their chat GPT to do the research, but what democracies in the world have soldiers that goose step? I think it's very rare. Taiwan may have been the last one that was a democracy until recently. We should leave goose stepping to North Koreans. They're going to be better at it anyway. Every military organization that I've interacted with that had an elite reputation and a high esprit de corps, in every example, the training was very, very hard, but also practical. So that it was training for actual combat. It was training in ways that taught people to be able to handle high stress, lack of sleep, very upsetting conditions, but with enormous respect for your fellow soldier. And many of the organizations that I've encountered, whether it was the US Marine Corps or other foreign militaries that I got to work alongside when I fought in Afghanistan in particular, there was a high degree of what we would call delegation, meaning you train junior people to be leaders themselves, not just followers. And then officers can trust their subordinates to be able to lead their subordinates without having to be supervised and micromanaged. And I think that those are the sorts of approaches that translate to a very deep, positive, and effective and self-confident military culture. And so we definitely wish Minister Koo well. It sounds like he's off to an extremely good start. The fact that Taiwan has only had, he's only the second, I believe, civilian leader of the Ministry of National Defense, meaning someone who wasn't previously a career officer, I think is a very positive change. You don't want the same sort of pedigree of person in those sorts of roles over and over again. In the United States, I think we've been much more successful when we've had civilian rather than former generals oftentimes leading our Department of Defense. There's a reason why we have a prohibition on recently retired generals from serving as our Secretaries of Defense.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it's really important to improve civil relations, which, again, I spent 3 years here working with Taiwanese military, and I did get the sense, and I think Taiwanese military officers will tell you that they don't feel very integrated in society, right? And we have a problem set now that really calls on the defense, the mission of defense of Taiwan, to be one that is cross-cutting, that is not only owned by the Ministry of Defense. And so I think having a civilian minister will help that. And it is true that we also have retired general as our Secretary of Defense right now, but there is actually a whole layer just below him, but below Lloyd Austin, of Deputy Secretary, multiple undersecretaries, assistant secretaries, that are all civilians, and they are on top of, higher ranking than all the uniformed people. So we do have that sense of true civilian control over the military. I think that's one of the signs of a democracy, frankly, and it may be one of the last vestiges of Taiwan's transition to a democracy that is behind, that hasn't quite happened yet. And so I think it's a very important step.
Thanks, guys. I've been signaled from off stage that we need to move on to questions from the floor, but also, did you need photos? Okay, so if you can bear with us for about a minute, I think we need to do another round of photos. And so, just folks, please. Okay. Thanks for bearing with us, guys. Okay. Stand up. Okay. Stand close. Okay. Taking questions from the floor, and I trust that folks will speak their mind. Let me do this. Let's take 2 questions at a time, and if you can help us by getting to your question as succinctly, as quickly as possible, so that we can address as many folks as we can in the time that we have left. And if you allow me, let us go to members of the press and distinguished guests first, and then before we open it up to folks, before we open it up to members of the general public. Just put your hand up, and if I can't see you, I'm going to put on my glasses. And I will help. We know you have perfect sight. Yeah. So, okay, yes, please.
There must be always somebody who starts. I have a question to Matt, to something that you said at the beginning. I understand that the book is about what kind of effect the deterrence has on what's going on in Xi Jinping's mind. And I must say that I tend to think like this until last week, when we had the equally interesting discussion with the guest that you invited with country, Tom Finger. So knowing his previous affiliation with the National Intelligence Council, he said this is completely wrong, because it's not important what is in Xi Jinping's mind. We have to rather look at two kinds of arguments. One are constraints, and one are restraints. This is the this is the division that comes from Jordan Schneider and his China Talk interview. So constraints are something that is external to China. External to the decision making. Restraints is something that is maybe in Xi Jinping's mind or in standing committee minds. So what is in the book? I have not read the book. What is in the book? Is it also about constraints? So the PLA is not ready, food security, energy, economics, blah, blah, blah. Or is it exclusively about restraints? Thank you.
Let's take one more, maybe. Yes.
I haven't read the book either. I suppose, and based on what you said during your presentations, I would suppose that the book deals more with the military aspect of things rather than political. But as you all know, much of the threat lies this side of the moat. We see, the situation, legislative yuan, with efforts trying to deal with the threat, potential threat from Taiwan being blocked by the opposition. And there is even talk that once the crisis begins, counties, in certain counties in Taiwan might, decide not to join the war effort. So I'm just curious as to what you might think about this here. Thanks.
So, yeah, constraints and restraints are part of the calculus that feeds the sense of optimism in the mind of this decision maker. So we write about some of the things that we think are playing in Xi Jinping's mind. He's looking at the capabilities of his own military, the capabilities of Taiwan, capabilities of the United States and others, but also the intentions, the will to fight. He's making calculations about that. So one is, he's going to be looking at the military strength and the ability, and his ability to apply that strength efficiently. His predictions about how outside nations will behave if the war occurs. Perceptions of whether there is internal unity or discord at home and in the lands of his enemies, namely here in Taiwan and in the United States. The more social turmoil there is in Taiwan and or the United States, the more likely war is. The more likely Xi Jinping is to pursue war. Knowledge or forgetfulness about the realities and sufferings of war is one of the important things here. The fact that the People's Liberation Army has not fought a major war in many decades, and the last time that it fought a very brief campaign against Vietnam was in the late 70s. A lot of people say that means that they're less likely to fight now. I think it's actually, history shows the opposite. Countries and militaries that haven't fought for a long time often have unrealistic expectations about what they can achieve in combat. So it can make them more reckless and more prone to miscalculation about how the war will actually go. Nationalism and ideology, we write about that factor. We write about the state of the economy and also its ability to sustain the sort of war that Xi Jinping is envisioning. And then, of course, it's the personality and the experience of those who share the decision, in this case, primarily Xi Jinping. Those are some of the examples of some of the factors that we examine. So a lot of those things you can apply constraints and restraints to, to that matrix of factors. Your points are about, the politics here at home. I think, remember I talked about the three warfares that Xi Jinping and his system talks about. Psychological warfare, information warfare, and legal warfare. This is something that only, Taiwan has to find the wherewithal to ultimately, I hope, to take steps to protect freedom of speech in Taiwan by ensuring that the public square is Taiwan's public square, not the Chinese Communist Party's public square. TikTok is the Chinese Communist Party's public square. So is Xiaohongshu, this other app. It is a big, big mistake for people in Taiwan, young people or old, to be using these apps. You can put your own content onto it, but whether your content gets amplified and is allowed to spread or whether it gets suppressed is up to a bunch of engineers and Communist Party officials who serve as the editor-in-chief and deputy editor-in-chief of ByteDance, the parent of TikTok. Why would you allow any government to control what you can and can't read and see? TikTok is anti-free speech. So I think that would go a long way, figuring out a way. The United States is grappling with the same problem. We were able to pass a bipartisan, nothing happens that's bipartisan in America anymore, yet senators and congressmen from the Republican and Democratic parties and a Democratic president of the United States just signed a bill that demands that TikTok no longer be under Communist Party control. It has to be under American ownership, or it will be banned. I think this is a really important piece of legislation.
Yeah, I'll just add on the final question about, if there are certain counties in Taiwan that maybe wouldn't want to fight back or what have you. I think that was the implication. We have to. This goes back to the beginning of the conversation about peace through strength, right, and protecting strength. Vladimir Putin, he believed that there were large segments and pockets of Ukrainians that would welcome the Russian army. That's what he believed. And I think that is absolutely the wrong message that Taiwan wants to be transmitting to Xi Jinping, right? That in fact they're welcome, that Taiwan would welcome the PLA, because again, that will only encourage aggression. I think that's quite obvious now. It should be inherently obvious to anybody in here, but if it's not, after what happened in Ukraine, it should be.
Yeah, let me just add, in the book we talk about not looking to the United States as a way of doing national defense. Okay? Specifically looking at other countries more similar to Taiwan, e.g. Israel. Okay? And I think to your question, the last question I believe from the Central News Agency, in the Israeli concept of whole society defense, there is this concept, this idea of the home front. And the home front is just as important as the front lines. Because if folks aren't taken care of, if garbage isn't collected, if the injured aren't tended to, then the government and the military loses the space to maneuver, loses the ability to defend, continue their work in defending and resisting. And so I think one thing I would like to highlight is that national defense has to be a whole of society effort, not just the military. Our military has approximately 160,000 personnel. In a country of 24 million, we cannot let the few shoulder responsibility of protecting our country. And as a practical matter, it's only when we bring in whole society, and that means nonprofits, that means citizens, that means industry, can we have a chance of building that national unity, demonstrating that will that Matt talked about, that intangible, that X factor in defense and in deterrence. So just an administrative reminder, after your question, please help us turn off the microphone on your in front of you. If you don't, it affects the interpreter's reception, so thank you. And if you can, if you're speaking from a media outlet, please help us, please identify yourself. So let's take two more. Yes, Chris, please.
Thanks. Chris Buckley from the New York Times. I think it was Matt who mentioned those words, status quo. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that. We see government leaders, including in Taiwan and elsewhere, speaking of the status quo as a basis for peace for Taiwan. We have public opinion polls where in some form or another, the public here supports something like the status quo, which I imagine means not permanently and decisively foreclosing some sort of arrangement around Taiwan that's acceptable to China. But it sounds like you're kind of skeptical of that as a basis for making the changes that Taiwan needs to make, or as a permanent basis for peace. I'm just wondering what your collective thoughts on that. Thank you.
learning those lessons, or secondly, ask, are there any implications of another war that's going on? And that is the war between Israel and Palestine. For example, one big issue is how would Taiwan and the United States react not only by a defensive deterrence or defensive response, but a counter-offensive. And we see this is what has been so costly to Israel in terms of casualties, especially on both sides, you could say, and also above all on global public support or opposition to Israel's position in the war.
I'll start with yours, Harry. It's good to see you, and Chris, come back to you as well. Good to see you as well. Look, some of the lessons, a couple that I mentioned, were that Beijing will find utility in nuclear blackmail, threatening nuclear war to try to keep the United States away from a conflict. The idea, this is speculative on my part, but I think the idea that it's better to go big than to tiptoe like Putin did, step by step incrementally into the Ukraine conflict. I think Xi Jinping is unlikely to start with military aggression that is small scale. He might. I don't think that's a great policy. I think he's probably the problem with, for example, attacking offshore islands like Jinmen is that he doesn't gain a whole lot from doing that, but he does start to incur an international response. The world starts to realize that Xi Jinping is an aggressive dictator, and that he really is someone who wants to use war to achieve his means. So that's going to invite coordination among allies. It means that more U.S. troops and equipment are going to flow into the region. It means that the U.S. starts to get a lot more serious about manufacturing and stockpiling munitions, or beginning to apply sanctions on Chinese banks. So I think it's more likely that he would go all the way. Others that we know that lessons they've drawn, because we've seen the PLA writing that's contemptuous of Russia's use of cyber warfare and its use of information warfare in the last 2 years against Ukraine. Beijing, or writers in Chinese military newspapers appear to have been surprised at how badly the Russians applied cyber and information warfare means. I think Beijing is confident that it will do a better job using cyber warfare and trying to cut Taiwan off from the outside world, cutting undersea cables so that you don't have internet coming in or going out. That's why it's very important for Taiwan to have multiple means of communicating with the outside world, including low Earth orbit satellite constellations, which can be replaced quickly if Beijing starts to destroy satellites. Those are a few, in any case, a few of the lessons.
Chris, if I understood your question right, and great, thanks for being here, then I think my view is that the United States would be happy with the political status quo indefinitely. In fact, I think the United States would just be happy to, bury our head in the sand and kind of be like, okay, as long as nothing bad happens. I think in Taiwan, we can argue about whether it's indefinitely or not, but it seems like an overwhelming majority of Taiwanese also would are fine with maintaining the political status quo. And that's all three presidential candidates, I believe, said that during the recent campaign. And the problem, I think, is, of course, in Beijing, where there is this growing sense of impatience. And you don't have, I don't think, a belief in the status quo. We can talk about whether that's 2049 or whether that's something Xi Jinping believes he has to do on his watch, which, at most we could give another, 8 or 10 years, right? Or when's he going to feel like And so those are important considerations. In fact, we were talking about how China was very unhappy, or said they were very unhappy, and had to punish President Lai for his inauguration remarks. When in fact, if I'm not mistaken, and I've studied this stuff myself, that when he said, for example, that that PRC and the ROC are not subordinate to each other, that Tsai Ing-wen had said something very almost identical to that, and in fact Ma Ying-jeou had said something almost identical to that, right, about the two sides of the strait. And so for China, the status quo means really we need to be moving toward what they would call reunification, or some kind of absorption. And that it becomes the principal destabilizer, right? When you have the other two parties that are comfortable with the status quo, but one that is trying to shift it, I think.
Chris, I would only add that I think looking at Xi Jinping's rhetoric and actions, it's clear that he is the one pressing for a change in the status quo. I don't think Taiwan's leaders have been pressing that change. Certainly the United States hasn't been pressing for that change. It's very much Xi Jinping who is now changing the game from one of preserving the status quo by threatening military action to prevent Taiwan from declaring independence to what he calls resolving the Taiwan question. 解决台湾问题, right? This idea that it has to be solved now. That very phrase contains an obvious assault on the status quo. This idea that it's now incumbent upon Taiwan to move towards political subordination to the People's Republic of China, or it might get attacked. So we always have to keep that in mind. And when people say, well, Taiwan shouldn't do anything to provoke, we just have to remember that the real provocation now is what Xi Jinping is doing to try to fundamentally change the status quo from from what it's been for almost 80 years to what he's aiming to make it.
Let's get a couple more.
Hi, I'm Easter. Your book, along with many other writings from the United States, obviously point out things that Taiwan needs to do to fix the problems in order to face the threat from China. And obviously, it should have been the job of the officer corps of the Taiwan military. And why is it that they're not doing it themselves? That includes a reserve system, training, conscription, misallocation of investments, all that. And if it's because of the culture of the organization that had resulted in this, can you realistically expect them to implement those changes from the outside pressure?
I understand the importance of deterrence. I believe the word you said that sometimes you just have to stay unnaturally strong, but just what? Uncomfortably strong, okay. But stay uncomfortably strong for a long period of time is very exhausting. Also, politically very unpopular. Okay, so I'd like to know, Matt, what do you think about this? Do you have any suggestion on this front?
The question about Taiwan's military culture, we write about that in chapter 4, and I'm happy to give you a copy of the book here afterwards, and to see what you think about it. But ultimately, this is a democracy, right? It means that the military is subordinate to the elected officials, which means that it's subordinate to all of you. And so it requires moral courage, political courage, to push for those sorts of changes. We have some senior former military in the room, including my friend Admiral Lee Si-min. You're welcome to help me answer this question if you want to, because I think you have very, very important ideas about this. But look, it requires leadership. It's not allowing the military to do its own thing. By the way, this isn't unique to Taiwan. We argue, we're not here to scold Taiwan. We actually scold the United States in this book, most vociferously, because we think that our military services have drifted away from the mission of deterrence, and instead they're buying things that they want and that are not well coordinated with other services to achieve the mission of deterring Xi Jinping, and that are not well coordinated with other militaries, including Taiwan and Australia and so on. And so it requires firm leadership. And it's why civilian leadership is so important on this front. The question about, you're right, look, again, the same answer. We're democracies. It is hard, right, to be vigilant, to constantly be purchasing things that aren't obviously useful until years later when you might actually need them. And if you're really doing it right, you won't ever need those things. It's really hard, but again, it's about political courage, moral courage. We've seen democracies get it wrong, and some of those democracies didn't survive to tell the story. I mean, if you look at the arguments that were taking place in Britain in the 1930s, Britain did everything wrong in the 1930s. It was appeasing Hitler. They thought that the nicer they were, they didn't want to rearm because they thought it would be provocative to rearm. And then slowly, bit by bit, Adolf Hitler built a larger military, then much larger military. And then when he started to use it, he used it in small ways first, like in the Rhineland on the French border. And when no one had the will to respond, that would have been the critical moment, by the way. World War II might have been averted if Britain and France and the United States decided to actually punish Germany for going into the Rhineland. They didn't have to fire any shots. They just marched in and violated their treaties doing it, but we decided we didn't have the guts to enforce it. So studying the history, educating the public about the history of other democracies that tried to be soft and appeasing and non-provocative, only to invite a far bloodier crisis that actually led to the extermination of a lot of democracies. If not for the collective actions of World War II of those countries that survived in Europe, together with the United States, we wouldn't have democracy today. So I hear your skepticism, and it's just difficult. But this is the price of freedom. It's vigilance. We have to be vigilant. Otherwise, we can let a dictator make decisions for us. I think that's a much worse way to live.
We talk about military culture, which really is what Euster is asking about a little bit in the book, and that's in Chapter 4. Chapter 4, authored by an excellent academic and practitioner, Michael Hunziker. And I know that he knows Taiwan well, and I believe he is due to be back here soon. So I hope we'll be able to put him in front of everyone. But I think just to add on to what Matt said, there's a couple layers here, right? It's about courage, indeed. It's about leadership. It's about education of your junior officer corps. It's all of that, right? It's about delegating, okay? It's about training in leadership skills. But it's also about not allowing and not expecting or demanding MND, the Ministry of National Defense, to be the sole owner of the defensive mission. Monopolies are horrible at innovating, right? There's plenty of business cases. We don't need to go into them one by one, and that's why we talk about standing up other agencies outside of the ministry. We want to create a healthy, virtuous cycle where folks compete for resources, where folks compete through performance, right? Where folks compete to stand out by what they do as opposed to avoid standing out by what, due to potential mistakes. So it's a culture of excellence, it's a culture of innovation. We think change has to happen not just via the ministry's, the defense ministry's own work, but the Ministry of Interior has got to get involved. And again, it has to be a whole society effort. We talked a little bit about the need for a territorial defense force. We don't have time to go over that today, but I think these are all ways that the entire government needs to step up and do more.
I guess I'll just add on the last point, the other example, the current world examples are right of why maybe Taiwan needs to get comfortable with being uncomfortable is Israel, right? And then obviously the example of deterrence failure in Ukraine, but we even have here in Asia, South Korea, which is a very capable military when you compare it to North Korea, but they still train hard, have long conscriptions, and invest, significantly in their military. And I think that actually brings a sense of peace, right, to the society, knowing that they have that. So sacrifices do have to be made.
Let's take a couple questions, if I may. Let's take a couple questions from the floor. So I see someone, yes, I can't see your name tag, but yes, please. Yep, I'm looking right at you.
Oh, all right. So much of the discussion has been about asymmetric warfare. This is clearly for Ivan, by the way. Good to see you. What about, so much of the discussion has been about asymmetric warfare, and it's about munitions over, buy more munitions, right? But what about ISR assets like drones and space-based assets like synthetic aperture radar? These are all commercially available. Intelligence is fundamentally a force multiplier. So I've noticed in your book, I've read it from front to end a couple times already, and you have lists on munitions and budgets for that, but I didn't see the same for ISR assets. You do mention it, but you don't really go to the same level. Is there a reason for that? I mean, I would imagine that ISR commercial open source data provides MOFA and MND and means of discourse without revealing national technical needs.
Ivan, let's take one over from the person to Jason's left. Right.
Hi guys, Shivani with the Washington Post. Obviously we've been covering in Southeast Asia a lot the aggression of the Chinese against the Philippines in the South China Sea, and there really hasn't been any regional response at all from ASEAN or even really from more broadly than that, right? It's really only the United States that's been pretty strident about speaking about what's happening in the South China Sea. Given that, are you sort of worried about Taiwan and a potential regional response? Because you really have seen the Philippines being very, very isolated, right? Compared to what the expectations maybe would have been. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I'll obviously take the first one, and I might push back a little bit because I feel like we hit on, maybe not in detail, and I think it is in, if I'm not mistaken, Chapter 6, in deterrence by detection. We do talk about satellite-based ISR. We do talk about subscription as a service. Those types of things, data as a service, and how to bring those in. Now the book doesn't aim to. Right, it's quite of a top-level book, but I think we do make hard recommendations in those areas too, as well as all the other areas. So I think I agree with everything you said, and if we didn't give it enough of a treatment, then then I'll take the hit for that. But that was certainly the intent. That I agree with you, ISAR is absolutely critical, and I think doing that, and that's part of the network way of doing that in day-to-day competition, right? And some of that can be replicated and used in a conflict scenario. Some of it will not survive in a conflict scenario, but kind of building those repertoires and kind of knowing how to execute is still significant, yeah.
Shabani, great question. When you have a bully, there are always a lot of fence sitters. There are people who don't want to, or countries that don't want to stick their necks out. But I know we were just in Japan talking to senior officials who were talking about how there's a great degree of concern about what Beijing is doing. So there's no indifference. There's just a lack of willingness to speak up. And in fact, Japanese officials were talking about how much they're hearing from Southeast Asian countries, how concerned they are about what Beijing is doing, and how much they hope the United States has the Philippines back. So it's sometimes we forget that when you have countries that hedge or that fence sit, they don't view the two big actors, in this case China and the United States, as sort of the same, just on different teams. They view one as aggressive and the other as either effective in backing its friends or is fading away. So the big fear that the region has is not about the U.S. coming, it's about the U.S. going. Does the U.S. start to fade away? That's the big fear that officials are talking about behind our backs, when they're concerned about the direction that things are going. But what did you want to add to that?
Just that it's not direct China, you shouldn't do this, but we have seen, upticks of trilateral patrols, if I'm not mistaken, with Japan, the United States, the Philippines. I think Australia's starting to do more with the Philippines, and all those moves are intended to send a signal to China that the Philippines is not alone. And obviously the United States says it very clearly based on our treaty commitments. Hopefully a lot of that is contributing to, deterring and getting China to not take risks.
And I should add that right now I think the U.S. does have the Philippines back. My sense is that the U.S. is offering substantial support if President Marcos wants it and needs it. And right now he's doing a good job of exposing Beijing's bullying. The Philippines is doing a good job in its own information sort of warfare. And I commend the Biden administration for the trilateral summit that I think it was in April when President Marcos and Prime Minister Kishida met with President Biden in Washington. That's unprecedented. I heard from Japanese senior officials this week how encouraged they are by the leadership that President Marcos is showing. So I think President Marcos is feeling courage from his own people who are outraged at the things that Beijing is doing to really bully a smaller country. This is the way Leninist dictatorships operate when given the opportunity.
I'm going to ask you to help really dot that I and cross that T. Just following up on that point, Philippines, Taiwan, we are, as you mentioned in the book, we are on the losing end of escalation dominance, okay, against PRC, against PLA provocations. And can you just help us, for the rest of us here, just draw that connection between what the Philippines is doing right and how they are helping their cause internationally? And specifically what they're not.
Yeah, so we do talk about, in the book, recommendation for Taiwan to do, we kind of wrote this before, a lot of this happened in the Philippines, but being able to, quite frankly, videotape what's happening, right, and record it. That's important. I think that, if China ultimately, and this goes back to the accidental wars, if they ultimately have military superiority, that advantage, that overmatch, then Taiwan doesn't want to go out into international waters and airspace and create an incident, not create an incident, be involved in an incident, more than likely due to Chinese aggression. But you know what? It becomes a he said kind of thing, right? They said this and the other guy said that. So, and it becomes a pretext. And Taiwan's got to be very wary of those situations. That comes from the idea that Taiwan should go meet these ships or aircraft in a very symmetric manner. And so it's sort of the opposite of an asymmetric approach. It'd be like, I got to get out there. He said, you know, the enemy's sending 5 ships at me. Let me send, you know, my series of ships out there and show them who's strong. There's no conclusion to that situation, I think, that favors Taiwan, right? Because China could be looking, if they have, like I said, that escalation dominance, they could be just looking for an excuse.
How about 2 more? Yeah, you okay with that? So let's just, if I may, the 1 and 2. Yep.
Cool. Yeah, I'm Will Glasgow from The Australian. I want to ask a question about Australia. So there's a chapter in the book, What Role for Australia? As the author, as the editor, I want to know, you know, why is there a chapter for Australia? There's not one for Canada, there's not one for South Korea, there's not one for the Philippines. So just talk to me about that. Is it Australia's geography? Is it an enthusiasm you've picked up amongst, you know, the Australian government to be a part of this? So why that chapter? And then still with Australia, Chinese Premier Li is visiting New Zealand tomorrow or tonight, and then Australia over the weekend. A part of the itinerary, he's going to go finish in Perth and go to a Chinese-owned lithium production facility. One of the things Ross Babbage talks about in his chapter is the role of resources, Australia as a non-Chinese producer of minerals in military applications. I wanted your thoughts on Premier Li's trip and you know, that part of the itinerary, I guess.
Emily Fan here. Thank you for the book. I learned a lot. One circle I just cannot square is energy related to that food security. I mean, there's no way to get around it. Taiwan imports almost all of its energy and a lot of its food. Do you think that matters at all? Would an attack, if it happened, be so quick that energy security just isn't so important? But if it is there any way around the fact that Taiwan is entirely reliant on the outside world for energy?
I'll do it in reverse order, and you feel free to chime in, Ivan. Look, Taiwan, I think, on food security is on much more solid ground than we had feared when we began our research. Taiwan produces more rice than it can eat. It has a lot of protein that it produces, whether it's soybeans or fish that you're pulling out. Your Ministry of Agriculture, I'm told, is working on plans that are designed to increase stockpiles and ensure that there's a sensible plan in place that would allow Taiwan to continue for a very, 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 very long time without the ability to import food. Energy is tougher. It's not dire, but Taiwan needs to be, we write about this in the book, but I'm more concerned about the energy situation. Solar farms and wind farms are important, they're great, but it's still single-digit percentage probably. Someone can correct me on the exact numbers. The nuclear plants, I think nuclear is actually very important for Taiwan. It is the only major source of energy that can't really be turned off unless someone's willing to bomb nuclear plants. I don't think that Beijing is likely to do that. There are also small modular reactors, these newer technologies, very safe nuclear reactors. They're building some in the United States right now. There are at least a couple companies that are already building these reactors. So it's not hopeless, but we need to face the fact that right now Taiwan would have to ration its energy pretty significantly in the event of a blockade and an invasion. So this is solvable, but it needs to be solved. And so it's something we've talked about a lot with friends of the Taiwan government. Australia, look, it's more, I think there's a lot of interest in the Australian government about what a crisis would mean over Taiwan. And that's true in Canada as well, but geography matters. Australia is closer. Beijing is making very aggressive moves in the Pacific Islands. What's happening in the Solomon Islands, I think, is extremely troubling. It reminds me of the early stages of World War II, what China's doing in the Solomons and in some of the other Pacific Islands. So Australia is feeling Beijing coming closer, a little too close for comfort. Australia has fought alongside the United States, or I should say the United States has fought alongside Australia in every conflict going back more than 100 years now. So we've got more than a century of mateship, to use the Aussie term, and Australia also has very deep technical expertise as well. A terrific military culture that has worked very well with Five Eyes partners, including the United States. So I think Australia is very interested in more than us, picking on Australia to shoulder a larger burden. Ross Babbage, by the way, who you mentioned, who wrote the Australia chapter, I think he did a very nice job of laying out some of the theories of deterrence. And how deterrence is not something, like I said earlier, it's not something that happens by accident. You actually have to procure, train, equip, and coordinate for the specific purpose of deterrence. Does that answer your question somewhat? Oh yeah, Premier, you asked, yeah. Look, I've always believed that the top leaders should be in close touch with Xi Jinping. I'm a strong supporter of the diplomacy that President Biden is personally pursuing, his video calls and face-to-face meetings. I think this is really important. I'm usually more skeptical of the sorts of activities that the Chinese Communist Party likes to lure governments into at the working level, where no real progress ever gets made. It's usually a system designed to stall and buy time and advance Communist Party interests. So I think it's reasonable that Australia's Prime Minister would be meeting, and the New Zealand leader would be meeting with the Premier as well as the Secretary General, but to do so with eyes wide open.
Speaking of rice, I want to share with you the favorite diet of kids in our family. It's rice and a protein they call orange meat. What is orange meat? It's rosong. And I'm not, but please don't mistake I'm not making a joke about, my intention is not to joke about what would be a very tough experience in that worst case scenario. My point though is that, and I want to go back to Matt's opening remarks, resilience takes practice, preparedness takes practice, and part of the practice that the public needs to have, facilitated by government, is to understand the sacrifices and the inconveniences that might come in the situations that we're talking about. If the government, if the military expects to use all the public gas stations, well, the public needs to know about it. Okay? If the government plans to ration energy use, food, okay, the public needs to know about it. When the public is aware, and this is part of a public campaign, okay, when the public is aware of what is coming, the public is prepared, and the public will not panic, and we are more likely to stand together and stand united. That's the only way that's the best chance we have, again, to actually prevent that worst case from happening in the first place, right? And so we're way over time. I'm going to leave it to Matt and Ivan with your final thoughts, and then we can thank folks for their time today. What do you think?
I see many friends in the audience, and I'm going to be in Taiwan for a couple of days, and I hope to catch up with you in person or at least by phone while I'm here. I apologize now in advance that Ivan and I are not going to be able to linger because we have an important meeting that we're going to run late for here. Actually, we have to go. But thank you so much for coming today. Thank you for reading the book. We brought a bunch of copies, even though it's not available until a bit later. We're working on a Chinese language edition for publication in Taiwan right now. So thank you very much again, and all critiques of the book are welcome.
All right, with that, thank you everyone
For attending today. I hope this has been helpful, and I know this is a conversation that we will pick up in the near future. Thanks so much.
我们现在拍一个大合照好吗？ Just take a good picture together.
对啊，多是我的，找过去那你们这个会回去发吗？
要啊，
要，
都来了怎么可以？怎么不？
我走了。
我要做点事。你觉得要在这里还是？
前面他不要走，他要走。
你要这里坐吗？那你等我一下下，拍一条档。
好。还是你要到外面坐？到外面 lobby 那边。
我在那个牌子前面。
好啊。
等我一下。然后直接跟你拿那个看板。
好。那我先关了。对，你想